Our second unit is about population and migration, and it'll take us several weeks to get through everything because this is an important chapter. It's hard to understand really the rest of the year unless you understand population trends and migration, how people move. And a lot of this is also an AP Environmental, and most of you are taking both courses. So we'll be spending a little over 3 weeks covering population and migration. The Chapter 2, Key Issue 1, gives you some basics. It talks about regions where populations are clustered and where is it sparse. And it defines the 3 different types of density used in population geography. So we talked about density already in Chapter 1, and now we're going to break it down because there's 3 measurements of density we use for humans. To start with, the book covers where you're going to find the largest concentrations of humans. Remember, concentrations means that people are clustered or dispersed in certain areas. So where in the world do we find people clustered? What clusters do we have? So 2/3 of the world's populations are clustered in 4 regions. And if you need to, maybe look at that, the AP Human Geography College Board region sheet that we used. Take it out of your binder and look at it while we're going over these regions. So East Asia has one of the world's largest population clusters, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So you're going to find 2/3 of the world's people living in those 4 regions. What characteristics, what absolute and relative location characteristics do these sites have? All 4 of those regions are low-lying areas. They have fertile soil and they have a temperate climate. So it's not freezing cold and it's not the desert. And you have to be able to farm. If you can't produce food, you're not going to have you're not going to have a huge concentration of people. So you have to be able to raise food. And these places are all near oceans or near rivers, so they have access to an ocean. And that allows movement and trade. So people tend to settle where there's access to places to grow food and where there's access to water so they can trade for goods that they need. If you look at this map, this is a cartogram just like we talked about in Unit 1. And this cartogram shows you the distribution of people by country, really, right? So the bigger countries have more people. Each little block is equal to, so every space this size is equal to 20 million, and the little tiny blocks are equal to 1 million. So you can see which countries are the most populous. And the most populous countries aren't always in those 4 regions. So the United States, North America, or the U.S., neither of those are counted as a region that's one of the most populous areas. We don't have the largest concentration of individuals. But the United States is a really big country, as is Mexico. So we still have some of the largest populations in the world. Where else do you find a large population? China, India, the U.S., and then you're going to have Brazil, then Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Russia, Japan, and then Pakistan and Bangladesh. And so these are the most populous countries, and some of them are in East Asia, like we talked about, and some of them aren't going to be in those areas. So there's a difference between the countries that have the most people and the regions of the world with the most people. So if you look at in Europe, if you add up all the people who live in Europe, there are more people clustered together in Europe than there are in the U.S. So that's why Europe is one of those concentrated regions. So there's a difference between looking at East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So looking at the concentration of people in regions compared to the actual number of people. And so here we have East Asia, Southeast Asia, and then Southwest Asia. So here are your largest concentrations of people, which I think makes sense why Europe has the largest concentration, but not one of the most populous countries. Their countries are smaller. But if you added up all those little tiny blocks, it would be more than here. And then your most populous countries will be China, India, the U.S., then Brazil, Mexico, and then Nigeria, Russia, Indonesia, and then Japan. So you should know the most populous countries that are laid out on the cartogram, and you should know the regions where most people are concentrated. Here we're going to look at persons per square kilometer. So we're looking at a measure of density, but you can also see that they broke it down into distribution. And so do you see here how Europe has more people, so it's more concentrated? And then you have Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Southwest Asia. And the red spots are where people are more densely packed in. And the U.S. has areas of high concentration, right? So parts of Florida, most of the East Coast, a little bit here on the West Coast, Mexico out in the peninsula area, and along some of the coasts in South America, and then along the Atlantic coast in Africa. But your concentration shows up really clearly here. You're going to find places where people don't live. So you're going to find sparsely populated regions, and that's where people avoid living, and that's because they're very dry, so they can't grow crops. So you'll find less people in deserts. You'll find less people in areas that are so wet they can't survive. You'll find less people in really cold places and less people in the mountains. If places are too harsh, people don't tend not to settle there. However, as we have more and more cultural advancements, people are able to live in areas that were basically unsuitable for life before we developed whatever technology allowed us to live there. So in chapter 1, we talked about the Netherlands, how they built the polders, the raised ground above the wetland area so they could farm it. Those polders allowed the Dutch to live in areas that were too wet to settle before. In the Everglades, when we built a system of canals to help drain the Everglades, while it may not have been the most sustainable practice, it made areas in like the Glades and Belglade and most of Clewiston County, people were able to have farms and build homes there. And that wasn't possible before we had the ability to, or the plan and the money to build those canals. The area where you're able to settle a permanent human settlement are called the ecumen. So if you look here, the region that was considered part of the ecumen for humans in 5000 BC was very small. You've got parts of Europe, parts of the Middle East, and Northern Africa. And then you've got some parts here in Eastern and Southwestern Asia. Then by AD 1, you can see that the ecumen has spread out. Now, partly it's because more people are on the planet, so we're dispersing, we're moving all over the world. But part of it is because we have advanced farming technology. This is where farming really started. So we had people settle here. So we have the beginning of grain farming and all of this in this area. And then as that knowledge diffuses and people move, we were able to settle in more areas. So in AD 1, we have people living in the southeastern United States permanently, in Central America, a little bit in Southwest United States, in the northern part of South America, just below the Sahara Desert, so the sub-Saharan parts of Africa, parts of North Africa, along the Middle East, the coastal areas of the Middle East, but the middle desert part is still mostly not settled, and then all along Europe, all the way along Eastern Asia and South Asia, and then Southwest Asia. And then if you look at by AD 1500, the ecumen is spreading. There are more places of permanent settlement. But where do you still not find people? You don't find people much permanently settled in Canada, Alaska, the southern part of South America that gets really cold, and you've got some deserts down there. Most of the Sahara Desert is still empty. The coldest parts of Russia aren't permanently settled. This part here, the colder lands, the mountain ranges of the Himalayas, Australia, because it's mostly hard to get to, and then Greenland, and you won't find people in Antarctica, and you still won't today, not permanently settled. And then as you move down to 1900, you can see again the range that's considered permanently settled by humans, or the ecumen, has grown again. And so now by 1900, the only areas that aren't permanently settled are deserts or areas like Siberia, the northern part of Canada, Greenland, the southern tip of South America, and then Antarctica would still be. If it's white on the map, it's basically ice. And so our acumen has expanded. And if we have more people, the more people we have on the planet, the more we have to make adjustments to live in areas that were previously considered unsuitable for life. So how do we measure population density? We have 3 types of population density we'll talk about. And it is really important that you keep them straight. So we want to make sure we're referring to the type of density we mean. The first part is the easiest one, arithmetic density. That's the kind we already talked about. So in this case, we're looking at the number of people per square kilometer, although a map or a table could show you the number of people per square mile. But in this map, it's persons per square kilometer. And so you can see where people are most densely inhabited. And again, you're going to get them in parts of Europe, Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, and Southwest Asia. So the number of people per square kilometer. The second type of density is the number of people that can be supported by a unit area of arable land. So you take the population and you divide it by the amount of arable land. Arable land means farmable land. So now you're looking at people, now how many people can live in an area and how much of that land can be farmed. So you're just making it a little more complex. And so some areas look a little less dense now because you can't support as many people by the arable land. So either people you aren't able to raise enough food in your country, or you're importing lots of country because your population's gotten unsustainable. So China, if you look at here, and like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, so these areas are so densely populated, right? They have the highest population densities. Same thing with Germany and Italy. But when you look at physiological density, there's not enough farmland to support that high level of density. So they have a lower physiological density. And you'll find higher physiological density in places like Colombia. And then the last measure is agricultural density. So now we're looking at the number of farmers to the amount of arable land. So now how many farmers live in India compared to how much land can be farmed? And you can see that there's a high number of farmers for land that's able to be farmed. Same thing in China. And so what you're going to see is where people have an economy that's based primarily on agricultural growth, or where you have smaller farms where people are growing food for just themselves or just their villages, you're going to have a higher agricultural density. So in countries that we consider like the developing world, right, the less developed countries, they will have a higher agricultural density than most of the highly developed countries or more developed countries. Like the US, we probably raise more food than some of these countries, but we do it with way less farmers. And that is it for chapter 2, Key Issue 1.